Okay, good evening, everybody, both here in Cirencester and out there at home or wherever you may be. My name's Neil Holbrook. I'm Chief Exec of Cotswold Archaeology, and it's my pleasure tonight to welcome you to the Cotswold Archaeology Annual Lecture. This is our 30th annual lecture, first one in 1995 by the late Graham Webster on Christians and Pagans, which I still remember. And in 2014, we rebranded the lecture as the Mick Aston Annual Lecture in memory of Mick Aston, who was a trustee of Cotswold Archaeology and a good friend of ours. Right, yeah, I'd like to introduce the speaker. We're really pleased tonight to have a good friend of Cotswold Archaeology, Professor Josh Pollard. Josh is a long-time friend of our organisation, been a former trustee of Cotswold Archaeology on our panel of academic experts, and he's Professor of Archaeology at Southampton University, but lives in Bristol, so he's a kind of a local to us. I've known Josh many years, and Josh has had a really interesting career. He's kind of done a kind of circular tour of Britain in terms of all the places he's worked at: Newcastle, Belfast, Newport, Bristol and Southampton. So it's kind of an arc, I guess. He's a prehistorian, I guess you might imagine that. Interested in the British Neolithic and questions about why are monuments built. And I'm sure we'll perhaps capture some of those thoughts tonight when we talk about Avebury. But he's well travelled. He's been to Easter Island, Rapa Nui, and like any self-respecting archaeologist who goes on holiday, what do you do when you come back? You write an academic paper on your holiday experience. But what Josh is above everything else is an enthusiast, and that his enthusiasm for his topic will shine through to all of you tonight, I have no doubt. We're here to talk about Avebury. Avebury, which North Wiltshire, but kind of not that far from here. In many ways, you know, perhaps to my mind, a slightly more, I think it's a more sort of authentic in some ways than Stonehenge, because I think because it's less manicured, it's less patrolled for obvious reasons. It always, whenever I go to Avebury, it always feels a place where you can still sort of touch the stones if you want to, which is, yeah. So it's a fascinating place, and Josh has worked at Avebury over many years, and he's going to talk tonight about Avebury, rethinking a henge and its landscape. So please give Josh a big welcome.
Okay, well, thank you, Neil. That was a wonderful introduction. And just to point out at the start that although my name is on the lecture, this is, of course, sort of talking about work which is that which has been sort of generated by teams of people, lots of other colleagues, and so in many ways it's the outcome of work which is shared rather than work which is just my own. And also should just quickly mention Mick Aston, and you know, his kind of legacy, his influence. I think it's fair to say that anyone who came into contact with Mick was much taken by his enthusiasm for the subject, his enthusiasm to ensure that archaeology was something that was accessible, that was out there for the public. I was fortunate enough to overlap with him a little bit at Bristol, just as he was in the final years of his employment there and then retirement. And he was a great supporter, it has to be said. Also, it's worth pointing out as well that Mick on various occasions mentioned his kind of love of the Avebury landscape. He was very taken by it. He was, of course, you know, first and foremost a landscape archaeologist and someone who could kind of, you know, read the pattern of the land. And I think in a way, Avebury offered so much, not just in terms of its prehistory, but its later archaeology as well, which captivated him. And you can actually search on the internet a rather sort of grainy record of quite a wonderful program he produced back in 1997 on Avebury in a series called Time Traveller, which I think captures his character very well, but also in a way captures a lot of the character of Avebury as a place. So I recommend that to you. So important to recognise Mick's influence and Mick's contribution. Now, Avebury, I presume that everyone in this room at least has been to Avebury. Does anyone want to admit to not going to Avebury? No, that's good. That's good. That's always heartening. Well, it's a very familiar place, and of course it's familiar because of the spectacular nature of its prehistoric archaeology, especially the archaeology of the Neolithic. But in many ways, both in terms of sort of public perception and also in terms of sort of histories of investigation, it's always been quite overshadowed by Stonehenge. So yes, it is one of the great prehistoric monuments of Europe, but its nearby cousin is always, if you like, there pulling in the media attention. And it's kind of interesting to sort of reflect on the sort of histories of investigation at each of these monuments, because in many ways they kind of ran in parallel from the early days of antiquarianism and archaeology up into the sort of mid-20th century, and have sort of diverged slightly ever since. Now, with both monuments, there's not been much in the way of active investigation since the mid part of the 20th century. But in the context of Stonehenge, there's been an awful lot more work which has happened, which has taken place within the environs of the monuments, or work which has sort of tangentially connected to the monument itself, and particularly through the sourcing of both the bluestones and the sarsens. And so we're in a situation where, in many ways, our knowledge of the Stonehenge landscape seems to be that bit kind of richer, that bit fuller than Avebury. And in the context of Avebury itself, we've really got to go back to the first sort of 4 decades of the 20th century in terms of any kind of concerted work that happened at the Henge and at the Stone Circle. First of all, with Harold St George Gray's work back in 1908 to 1922 to actually date the monument, undertaking these wonderful excavations, which now I think probably wouldn't quite get past health and safety requirements. Even if you use students, I think you'd run into trouble with that. And then followed up by Alexander Keeler's work in the late 1930s, and Keeler being much more interested in trying to sort of reconstruct Avebury in a way, influenced by the manuscripts of people like William Stukely, of Stukely's observations during the early 18th century, wanting to put back, if you like, the megalithic elements of the complex. But in the process, actually producing a very good kind of archive of work, and one which a colleague of mine, Mark Gillings, is busy leading a project on, basically getting that archive kind of digitized and made accessible, and going back through the rich material that exists held in the Alexander Keeler Museum. But although that work happened at some scale, it obviously leaves an awful lot of questions unanswered. And of course, as time goes on, our kind of agendas change, our kind of requirements of knowledge change as well. And now we're in a situation where there's a lot that we need to know about Avebury, which undoubtedly will require future fieldwork. Just here, having obviously to battle through the bureaucracy that is set up to prevent work taking place at scheduled ancient monuments. So what I want to focus on is really sort of thinking about the monument, thinking about how it came into being, when it came into being, which is still a bit of an open issue, and trying to think about how events at Avebury connect to events elsewhere within the Neolithic world, in Britain and Ireland in particular. But first of all, I think it's important to actually sort of look at the local landscape, the local sequence, to understand something about the nature of Neolithic activity within the landscape, and here to actually take something of a kind of landscape focus, and to take a focus that sort of initially takes us away from the monumental in order to provide something of a setting. So we can begin by thinking about the kind of environs of Avebury, thinking about what was going on during the 4th and into the 3rd millennium BC within the Upper Kennet Valley, this block of sort of chalkland in North Wiltshire, and thinking in particular about the kind of relationship between histories of settlement and monumentality. And that's been a focus of a project that myself and others have been involved with since 2016, which has been designed to actually sort of look at the nature of settlements, of Neolithic occupation and early Bronze Age occupation within this landscape, and to think about how that connects through to the way that this became such a prominent focus for monument building and for ceremony. And behind it all is the idea that the everyday, the kind of quotidian, the process of living within landscapes is intimately connected to those landscapes becoming sacred, becoming special, and becoming the focus for monument building. It's also about trying to understand how the demands of making monuments could have an impact on settlement within the region, kind of pull and push of labour requirements, for example. And also, as part of the project, trying to understand more about the physical nature of the landscape, its kind of environment, trying to understand people's relationships with natural phenomena. This is a landscape that originally was a stonescape because of the ubiquity of locally occurring sarsen stone across this area. Stone that, of course, was used to make the Avebury monuments and used to make the chambers of early Neolithic chamber tombs. So we've had a team of people who both archaeologists and also some environmental archaeologists, geophysicists who have been sort of looking at the character of that kind of record. And, you know, foremost is this idea that thinking about these landscapes, not as ritual landscapes, not as ceremonial landscapes, not as places that are sort of separated from the everyday, but thinking of them as places that were part of routine, places that were visited, places were inhabited, actually offers quite an interesting and different perspective on thinking about monuments. Now, the problem is that, of course, during the Neolithic, people were very willing to put a huge amount of time and labour and effort into dragging around stones, setting up big timbers, creating large earthworks for ceremonial purposes or for creating funerary monuments. But they didn't put anything like that effort into the kind of architecture of everyday life. And so we have this curious imbalance where we can see a rich record of Neolithic ceremonial activity, but we struggle sometimes to actually make sense of what routine life was like and where people were living and so forth. Now, this is largely because the sorts of structures that were constructed tended to be quite ephemeral, sorts of structures that people lived in. Generally, settlements were unenclosed, so you don't get ditches, you don't get palisades. And what we do tend to end up with as our primary record are things like scatters of worked flints, which are present across the plough soils, across the soils of these regions. And where those scatters are dug, occasionally you might find pits, you might find hearths, you might find the odd stakeholes and so forth. It's not easy evidence to engage with, but actually it still is critical evidence if we're to actually understand the nature of the way in which these landscapes were inhabited. If you like flint, it's good. If you don't like flint, walk away, I think is the best answer. But equally, we were kind of interested in the nature of the paleo environment, and we were interested in trying to sort of think about where there might be good preservation of contemporary settlement traces. So we had input from Mike Allen and Charlie French on the geoarchaeology and the paleo environment. Mike and Charlie have drilled so many auger holes across this landscape that I fear if there's any kind of earthquake activity, it will actually perforate and separate into a series of blocks. And we also had input from a Belgian colleague, Philippe Desnet, who's undertaken some wonderful landscape scale geophysical survey work explicitly designed to actually map deposits and sediments, and work that allows three-dimensional reconstruction of sediments to be picked up. To look for areas where there might be sort of colluvial fills in valleys and buried soils and so forth. Perhaps the big surprise has been the fact that there aren't great depths of buried soil within the valley bottoms, which Mike and Charlie have suggested relates to the fact that this originally never was a particularly kind of wooded landscape. It never had thick woodland soils. It was always quite an open landscape in the early part of the Holocene. And perhaps its open character was something that actually attracted Neolithic communities into the area. Good soils, open ground, good water supply, etc. Now we've undertaken and continue where we can to undertake various excavations on a range of sites, but in particular on locations where we suspect that there is Neolithic settlements, and some of those are indicated here. A lot of that work has involved a rather fashionable process of actually digging the soil rather than just machine stripping it off. It's a luxury, I think it's fair to say, because it is very, very labour intensive to actually go and excavate plough soils. But we're aware of the fact that sometimes 90%, 95% of the artifactual record for these settlement sites actually resides within the plough soil, resides within the topsoil in terms of these flint scatters. And by stripping them off, you may be able to expose pits and other features, but you're also missing a lot of the evidence of what was actually going on the surface. So we've trained a whole generation of students who are very good at digging checkerboards. I just want to give you a bit of a flavour of the results of some of that work. So the first site that we dealt with actually went back to a location that had first been encountered by Alexander Keeler in the 1930s, when he started his work of excavating and restoring the megalithic monuments. Oh, why is it doing that? Anyway, he began his work in 1934 by focusing on part of the megalithic avenue leading out of the southern entrance of the Avebury Henge, the West Kennet Avenue. And the first trench that he dug actually hit a very dense spread of worked flint and prehistoric pottery. He recognised that this was an area of habitation. He was working off chronologies at the time, understood it was late Neolithic in date, and imagined that this was an area of settlement that immediately preceded the construction of the avenue. We actually know now that much of what he found belongs to the Middle Neolithic. It belongs to a time probably about 800 centuries earlier than the avenue. But we were struck by, first of all, the quantity of stuff that he found during his work, but also the condition of it as well. So this is a fairly routine bit of the landscape, you might imagine that, like everything else, has been quite heavily ploughed. But first of all, he was finding soft, friable prehistoric pottery within the topsoil, and he was also finding bits of worked flint which were absolutely fresh. And we thought, well, there's got to be something going on here in terms of preservational conditions, which seem to be sort of allowing these settlement traces to survive in situ. So we undertook various bits of work around the area where Keeler had dug, in the process actually finding quite a rich scatter of especially worked flint and ceramics and other material, in places ranging up to close to 300 pieces of worked flint per square metre, which is actually quite colossal. And all of it very, very fresh. Basically, it's where it was dropped, where it was deposited. The only thing that's happened to it is that it's all been deflated down to the bottom of the soil profile through worm action. The soil here being a little bit thicker than elsewhere, and the worms thankfully taking all this material down below the level at which later medieval and 19th century ploughing wasn't able to reach. So we've got a site where we were able to see spatially the pattern of activity, and linked with the presence of cut features as well. We're able to sort of see something about the kind of history of this location as a place, from the early part of the Neolithic through to its monumentalization with construction of the avenue. And they're just an image of some of the sort of a few of the flint scrapers that we've found. Now, it's clear that the bulk of what was going on here happened during the Middle Neolithic. So between about 3,200, 2,900 BC, which increasingly we're recognizing is a very interesting time within this landscape, but a very interesting time in the Neolithic in Britain and on adjacent parts of the continent in general. As we were aware that after about 3,400 BC, things changed dramatically. We moved from a world where we've got people engaged in mixed farming that characterizes the early Neolithic, through to people who are basically pastoralists, so people who aren't engaged in cereal cultivation, but are involved in keeping domesticated animals, and people who are probably living relatively mobile lives. And this is a site, and maybe quite a sort of special settlement site, that relates to that kind of Middle Neolithic phase. We found wide range of both heritage left over from working flint and also flint tools. What is interesting is the fact, given that we're in a flint-rich landscape, a lot of the flint that's present in this site isn't local. We don't know where all of it comes from, but we know that a good percentage of it is from sources outside the region. Some of it we can identify. We know, for example, we've got bits of bullhead flint that have come from possibly around Windsor, or maybe further to the east. We've got bits of green sand chert. We've got bits of flint which are likely northern, so possibly from areas like Lincolnshire, East Yorkshire, and so forth. And it looks as though this is not being brought in as blocks of flint which have been exchanged or traded, but this is coming in as cores or coming in as finished tools, and in some ways is likely to be a kind of proxy for the movements of the people who are gathering and living at this spot. And so immediately we've got a sense of a location where people may be coming to from quite wide areas of southern Britain. We're able as well to sort of pull out different chronologically distinct elements within the lithic scatter and see different phases of activity. So while most of the flint work belongs to that Middle Neolithic settlement phase, we've also, for example, got an early Neolithic component and an interesting early Bronze Age component, which relates to a time just after the avenue was dug, and where we're getting a range of flint arrowheads and knives, but not the range of scrapers and other tools that you'd normally expect to find from a settlement. Rather curiously, the arrowheads represent a wide range in terms of their quality, from really beautifully made examples to others that would, well, in degree terms would be a third, if not maybe just a marginal pass. And actually what we think is going on is that some of these are pieces which have been made by people who are learning to work flint. They cluster as well around the location of a beaker burial, kind of Chalcolithic burial, that Keeler found during his work in the 1930s. And it could be that what we're looking at are forms of kind of gathering, ceremony, deposition of artifacts which are actually connected to either the funeral or to link to kind of funerary commemoration. But apart from the burial itself, a kind of record of activity that exists entirely within the soil itself. We can sort of move on and think about one or two other locations as well we investigated. So another site, this time to the east of Avebury, going up onto the higher grounds. Again, a site that had been located first of all in the earlier part of the 20th century, back in the 1920s by W.E.V. Young and the Reverend Kendall. There's a story about the Reverend Kendall which we've never been able to work out whether it's true or apocryphal. He was a local vicar at Winterbourne, Monkton, a prolific collector of worked flint. He amassed a huge collection of worked flint. And so the story goes, in his later life, he went a bit mad and he believed he was a flint. Okay. And then starved himself to death. So it's a warning, okay, about the limits of interest in flint. But anyway, this is one site which he and Young found, and we were quite interested in it because again, it had interesting Middle Neolithic, early Neolithic elements. It seemed to have lots of axes. There's a possibility of axe production taking place. Its location had been lost for quite a while. We were able to relocate it, do some surface collection, and then undertake some excavation. And actually, we found, in fact, this is a very large but very varied scatter. We probably didn't actually locate the particular hotspot that Kendall and Young had found, but we are able to, from the work, actually isolate a number of different phases of activity. The bulk of the worked flint, of which there's plenty of it, is probably actually of Bronze Age dates, and it's part of a very extensive scatter that could be linked to the creation of field systems in the Middle Bronze Age. But within it, we can identify especially late Mesolithic, Middle Neolithic, late Neolithic components, early Bronze Age components, and in this case also linked to pits and pit deposition of various kinds. One late Neolithic pit, for example, being especially odd in terms of containing two post settings, a bit of modified human skull, some pieces of flaked chalk, fossils, and various other things that seem to be deliberately deposited within it. But here, a focus for repeated return, repeated settlement, with a particular emphasis on the Middle Neolithic, much like we saw with the West Kennet Avenue site. In other locations, different sorts of signatures. So in 2018, we went down into the bottom of the Winterbourne Valley, just immediately to the west of Avebury. Here, quite deeply buried soils. In fact, we spent most of our time dealing with medieval archaeology, wedged between phases of alluvium before we got down to what's predominantly Mesolithic and a little bit of early Neolithic activity, which may be quite sort of typical of what's going on down in the bottom of the valley around the source of the River Kennet and the Winterbourne. What's interesting, though, is that although there's a little bit of Neolithic flint work here, most of it seems to be early. And then there isn't an awful lot that actually belongs to later phases, Middle Neolithic, late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, despite its proximity to the Avebury Henge. And what we're finding is that this zone to the east, to the west of the monument, sorry, seems to be one where there's an avoidance of settlement after about 3,500 BC or thereabouts, which may well relate ultimately to the way that the landscape's being categorized and relate to the way in which the landscape's being organized, eventually in relation to the Henge monument itself. Now, the problem with doing a program of research that's based largely upon focusing on settlement is the fact you crack every once in a while. Or at least you find justifications for going off and digging a monument in the sense that you're looking at the relationship between monuments and settlement. It is essential. So one place that we looked at was a complex of palisaded enclosures to the south of Avebury, down in the Kennet Valley at West Kennet, which first saw serious investigation in the late 80s, early 90s, through the work of Alistair Whittle. Who was able to show that there were late Neolithic dates linked to grooved ware, lots of animal bone, lots of evidence of feasting taking place here. And Alistair suggested there could actually be a connection between the Palisades and the activity happening here and the construction of the monumental mound at Silver Hill, which lies just to the west. But the various things we're interested in, first of all, through looking at work that had been done back around 2000 by Wessex Archaeology as part of an arable reversion scheme, we're aware that there were flint scatters that were present within the area, but which seemed to sort of lie in the spaces between various elements of the Palisade complex. And we're curious to know whether or not what we're looking at was a pattern of, if you like, big wooden sacred enclosures with areas of extramural settlement around them. We're also aware of the fact that Alistair's work had at the time sort of avoided trying to look at some of the the intersections between palisade elements, and avoided, if you like, trying to look at the sequence of the complex, which we imagined could be quite complicated. So we also focused in on looking at the junctions between bits of palisade and radial palisade line and so forth. And also focused in on an outlying element, structure 5, down in the south there, where aerial photography and geophysics had shown a number of rather curious irregular pit-like features, which merited investigation. So we excavated some of the scatters. Most of those look to be a mixture of late Mesolithic, middle Neolithic, a little bit of early Bronze Age, seem to indicate periodic settlement of sorts taking place there, but not necessarily able to kind of tie it down to being contemporary with the monument itself. With structure 5, we were able to identify within the center of that structure a series of features which belong to a major timber structure, monumental timber structure, which seems to be rectilinear in form rather than circular, as most late Neolithic monuments are, which belongs to the very end of the Neolithic, to the 25th century BC. So quite contemporary, likely, with Silbury Hill. And here, with post settings on a very colossal scale. So a couple of the post holes that we were able to get to the bottom of were 3 meters deep, and containing posts which were a good meter or so in diameter, and posts which looked to have been replaced. We did actually have to stop excavating some of them because we discovered that actually in the bottoms of the post pipes, the areas where the posts originally were, rather than completely filling with soil, we actually had voids which were left, meter plus deep voids. And it was only when someone nearly disappeared into the void, as it were, that we recognized the presence of these things. And actually, we also became aware of the reason why the small road that runs partly through the middle of this monument is so deeply potholed, because basically bits of the road are falling into the partially well, destabilized post holes here. The structure begins as a freestanding monument. It's analogous, I suppose, in terms of its scale to things like Henge, to the southern circle at Donington Walls, to the Sanctuary and so forth. And with those monuments, people like Richard Bradley have talked about them as being buildings which kind of mimic houses. They're a bit like great houses, if you like, structures that may be created to provide a degree of community cohesion, particularly in times of change, as it were, and using the kind of house as a metaphor for creating a sense of community around these buildings. And it's tempting to see this as being something of that kind of nature. But it also, like so many of these late Neolithic monuments, it changes its form over time. So it begins as a freestanding timber structure. There's the post rots. It's then enclosed within, first of all, a henge earthwork, a bank and a ditch. That ditch is then backfilled, and a palisade is then created within the ditch. And then across the interior of the site, probably a few centuries after those posts had gone in and as they're beginning to rot and disappear, we have a whole pockmark of small pits which were dug into the tops of these features, many of which were empty, others of which would contain odd deposits of bone or antler. But in one case, one of those pits contained a double burial of 2 inhumations, both male, one quite young, one older, and their grave had been marked by a large sarsen boulder, which we also found. We're also able to recognise that the burial had partly been dug into the top of one of these rather sort of insufficiently silted post pipes, and the process of marking the grave with a boulder basically resulted in the bodies being pushed down or partly pushed down into the post pipe, and at a point in time when the bodies were still semi-articulated. And it makes you wonder what was going on in the minds of the people who buried these individuals as they watched over the course of a year or so, how their big sarsen gravestone was slowly sinking in and being absorbed into the ground. There were other odd things about this part of the site as well. It also, within those later pits, within the grave, we found quantities of non-local stone, so-called granite diorite or grus, which hasn't turned up anywhere else within the complex, hasn't turned up anywhere else within any site in Wessex, and which we now know came from a source in the Cheviot Hills of Northumberland. So many tens, given the sample size of the excavation, maybe many hundreds of kilos of this rock have been brought down from the Cheviots and buried within this monument. Why? We don't know, because it's not a stone that could be used for anything in particular. It's not part of broken up megaliths, but it seems to be a way in which people were asserting a very real connection between this site and a location up in the far north. Now, once we start to put together the work that we've done and the evidence from other sort of sites, settlement sites, and so forth within this area, we can begin to build up a bit of a picture of what's going on in terms of the intensity of settlement, where that settlement's taking place, how it links to monument building, and so forth. It's very common right across the area to find good early Neolithic presence. So the first Neolithic farmers moving into this region were occupying quite large parts of the region, quite sort of dispersed in terms of the character of settlements, initially at least. A lot of activity taking place at the enclosure at Windmill Hill on the northern part of the region. We've also got plenty of evidence of Middle Neolithic activity, as we saw with the West Kent Avenue occupation sites, as we saw with Avebury Down and various other locations as well. What's weird is the fact that if we look at the phase that goes with the major monument building events during the late Neolithic, settlement is much less evident. And there are only really a couple of places where we seem to sort of pick it up. One of which is on Overton Hill, close to where the sanctuary is, overlooking the West Kennet Palisades. And the other, which we know through the activities of Kendall and Kilo and so forth, is up on Windmill Hill. And Windmill Hill remains a major focus for settlement right throughout the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age. But you'd imagine there'd be a simple correlation between monument building and people living within the region, but that's not the case. If anything, the picture for the late Neolithic looks as though there may be much more kind of coming and going, that people may be coming into the region to build monuments, but not necessarily having a kind of sustained presence. Yeah, you've got to memorize this. So there we go. There's a quick summary. It'll be multiple choice tests. Okay, I'll skip over that. So onto the monuments, onto the henge. So how does the henge sort of fit into all of this? Because, you know, after all, the henge is the focal point within the landscape. It is the feature around which certainly so much of what was happening in the middle and the late Neolithic pivoted. So, you know, what have we got with the monuments? Well, actually, it's a kind of composite thing, because we've got the henge earthwork, the bank and the ditch, which surrounds a series of megalithic settings, including the outer stone circle, built, as with all the megalithic elements here, out of locally occurring sarsen stone. And then within that, we've got two smaller, yet still colossal stone circles, the southern and the northern inner circle, as well as further megalithic settings within those inner circles. And then, of course, the avenues leading out of the monument, leading out from the south and the west, off to the sanctuary on Overton Hill, off to the Longstones Cove, to the west. Now, we have plenty of evidence to suggest that this wasn't constructed in one go, that this isn't a single phase monument, but it was created in a series of stages. We have good dates from the ditch, or at least from the earthwork that we see today, which kind of suggest it was constructed maybe around 2500 BC, when a lot of monument building was taking place across southern Britain. We've got one or two other bits of dating evidence that suggests various components are both earlier and later. But our chronology is still really quite lacking in various ways. And part of it relates to the fact that during the Neolithic, people seem to have a taboo about putting anything that could be radiocarbon dated into stone holes. Okay, they knew how to make life difficult for us. And other materials proved to be fallible. So we did, for example, find bits of carbonized grain way down in one of the stone holes of the cove, which showed that it had been constructed in the 16th century. Don't trust dates on seeds. Okay. So what we can do though is to pull together various bits of evidence through keel and raise excavations, through the bits of dating evidence we have, to come up with a suggested sequence. And first of all, it's looking increasingly likely that the first bit of monumental activity, following on from phases of settlement, belongs to the Middle Neolithic, belongs to probably somewhere close to 3000 BC or thereabouts. But then much of what we see in terms of the main earthwork, in terms of the outer stone circle, in terms of the avenues, then comes in the sort of 26th, 25th, 24th centuries BC. So there might be quite a gap within the sequence. And then we've got various bits of modification of some of the stone settings. We've got bits of deposition of human bone within the ditch that continue on into the early Bronze Age before the site becomes, should we say, very quiet after about 1600 BC. And that sequence actually is more or less the same kind of story in outline detail of what we have for Stonehenge, and suggests that actually the way in which these monuments develop is quite closely interrelated. But the two big phases of activity are, first of all, this Middle Neolithic phase and this late Neolithic phase of construction. Now, I suppose one thing that we're beginning to kind of understand is the fact that people weren't building monuments all the time across the course of the Neolithic, but actually monument building, as well as being quite regionally localized, was also quite episodic. It happened within often distinct horizons. And that's especially so as we go into the later 4th and the 3rd millennium BC, when there are two horizons that really stand out. So one is at the very end of the 4th millennium BC, 3200, 3000 BC, where in various parts of Britain and Ireland, we actually see the beginnings of some of these big ceremonial centres. So, for example, in the Boyne Valley in Ireland, the construction of the great passage grave tombs there. Up in Orkney, we've got things like the passage grave tombs, the Nessa Bodka, etc., etc. And within Wessex, we've got the beginnings of some of the key monuments, places like the first phase of Stonehenge and the first phase of Avebury. And then there seems to be something of a lull, which may relate to something of a dip in terms of population numbers. And then everything goes crazy round about 2500 BC, when we have the largest constructions being created, including the Sarsen and Bluestone phase at Stonehenge, the reworked earthwork, outer stone circle of Avebury, Silver Hill, and so forth, which has probably got something to do with the appearance at that point in time of beaker communities coming across from the continent and local communities responding in a slightly millenarian fashion to a sense of their, perhaps ideology, worldview being challenged through new belief systems, new networks, and so forth. It's that ongoing saga, isn't it, of how Britain responds to Europe. So sort of generally by going slightly crazy for short periods of time and then calming down. But it's this Middle Neolithic phase which is quite interesting, because that I think sort of links into the beginnings of Avebury. And certainly elsewhere, what we see is, first of all, a change in monumental form, a move away from things like sort of long barrows, chamber tombs, or structures which are rectilinear, like cursus monuments and so forth, towards circular archetypes, new monument types, like passage graves of Ireland and the west of Britain, the appearance of henge monuments, stone circles, timber circles, and so forth. And in some cases, this may be linked to if you like, experiments in very extreme forms of social ranking. So it may be that we're moving from a situation of relatively flat social structures to ones where there are very accentuated, albeit briefly lived hierarchies. So in the context of the Boyne Valley and Newgrange, we have genetic evidence there to show that one of the individuals buried in the furthest chamber, the kind of holy of holies, as it were, was a product of an incestuous union, which has been suggested could link through to ideas of divine chieftainship and kinship, which we find documented in places like Egypt and who contacts Hawaii and so forth. So it may be that we've got these moments of very, very sharp social ranking, which are linked to monument building, linked to elites kind of also creating monuments which referenced major celestial events too. But this is not something that's sustained. This is something that then collapses relatively quickly. So within the Wessex region, we have, of course, the first phase of Stonehenge, which, albeit beginning as a simple earthwork, is remarkable because we're pretty certain that it contained the blue stones brought from Purcelli, which was a remarkable feat of long-distance megalithic movements. And also work by Susan Greene and Pete Marshall has suggested that the analogous earthwork at Flagstones in Dorchester could be of the same kind of date. Both these monuments, of course, linked quite closely to funerary deposits of various kinds. Now, if we were to look for Middle Neolithic features, or the first features of Avebury, what would we have? Well, we know, for example, that the earthwork that we see today is a reworked earthwork, that there's an earlier phase of bank, and so presumably an earlier phase of ditch, which is buried within the more colossal earthwork that's present. We have the inner stone settings, particularly within the southern and northern inner circles, where we've got good indications of them being set up in the Middle Neolithic. Maybe the inner circles themselves could belong to this horizon. And then there are one or two other features which may or may not be of this date, or which may or may not even exist. My favourite being the funny double earthwork down the bottom there, which when you talk to the locals, they seem to remember people driving lorries in exactly that kind of circuit about 40, 50 years ago. So it may not be prehistoric, it might be relatively recent. But in terms of the primary earthwork, there have been various bits of excavation since the late 19th century through the bank, which have revealed traces of a smaller phase of bank, about 2 meters high, over the top of which is a very well-developed buried soil. So a bank that's been constructed and has been left long enough for a good soil to develop over the top of it. And in places that bank is lying over the top of spreads of early and middle Neolithic occupation debris. The fact that this has been picked up at several locations around the southern part of the monument suggests that the earthwork that we see today more or less follows this primary earthwork, which is likely to be quite early in date. So we can think about its position, its form actually being fossilized within the earthwork that we see today. Now, one interesting thing which isn't often remarked about, everyone thinks of Avebury as being a very kind of a regular circular monument. It's sort of lacking symmetry. And that's because of the way in which our attention to its form is drawn in relation to the causeways, the entrances, which are emphasized during the creation of the second phase earthwork around about 2500 BC. But actually, there is symmetry to the earthwork, and it's seen particularly in terms of the way in which you've got a very well-developed, even kind of arc over on the southeast side. where you've got this sort of funny kind of arrangement where you've almost got a sort of squattering or a kind of trapezoidal character to the earthwork over on the west as well. So we can see that actually it probably does have a kind of basic geometry, basic plan geometry, and that likely was laid out during the Middle Neolithic phase. Now we can find plenty of analogies for this kind of form. If you like circular monuments, but circles that had sort of elements of facading or elements of access by being slightly squashed in various ways. We can see it, for example, with things like the stone circle up at Long Megan and Daughters in Cumbria, where we now got good Middle Neolithic dates. We can see it with various sort of passage graves, including some Finchethley and Anglesey, but especially with the format of the Newgrange monument, which Andrew Powell pointed out, was laid out with a degree of kind of precision. Again, the slightly sort of egg-shape format is something that is very similar to what we see with the Avebury earthwork, although not to scale. You can kind of superimpose them and you can see a similar kind of geometric structure to these monuments. So it likely suggests that initially, at least, the first phase earthwork is one that has an axis. It has an axis and orientation that is broadly taking it to the southeast. Doesn't seem to have any solstitial alignment or connection, but it is quite markedly southeasterly. And it could be that there are earlier causeways, there are earlier gaps, which have just been buried under the later bank or obliterated by the cutting of the later ditch. Now, we can find also local analogies for this as well. So we can see it, for example, if we look at Windmill Hill, we can see it in terms of the format of the earliest elements, the inner enclosure ditch, which dates to about 3650 BC. We can also see as well when we look at the way that the wider enclosure at Windmill Hill, which overlooks the site of Avebury, is laid out, again has a similar kind of format to it. And there have often been suggestions that perhaps Windmill Hill could have provided a kind of a template, as it were, for the Henge. It's interesting as well to note that although the primary phases of construction and activity at Windmill Hill would date several centuries earlier than Avebury, there is a well-defined Middle Neolithic phase in terms of presence and deposition within the ditches, but also reworking of part of the outer circuit on the southeast side, on the side that overlooks the Avebury monument. So it could be that when the Avebury earthwork was being constructed, they were quite consciously drawing upon the format of a well-established and important place within the landscape. This is a direct reference back to the past, back to the earlier stages of the Neolithic within this region. Now, moving on inwards, in terms of the inner circles, their scale are amongst the largest stone circles in their own right within the British Isles, links them again to early monuments like Long Meg, like the Dismantled Circle at Weinmarn in Preseli, and so forth. And also they are slightly squashed, slightly ovoid in form, which again is reminiscent of another of those monuments. The inner settings within these circles also have good claim to be particularly early. So we've got two sets. We've got the box-like setting of the cove in the northern inner circle, and then we've got an arrangement of other stones and what was originally a substantial upright in the centre of the southern inner circle, which was referred to by William Stukely as the obelisk, before it got smashed up and turned into field walls. Certainly we know with the cove that through an optically stimulated luminescence date, that this has a range which would put its construction into that Middle Neolithic horizon. It's also interesting as well that with one of the stones, stone 2, that this is the largest of the megalithic settings within the Avebury complex. Actually, another 3 meters of it or so lies buried underneath the ground there. It weighs something in the order of about 100 tons. It's one of the largest megaliths within the British Isles. And perhaps kind of interesting in a way to sort of think of it as being a structure that is in some ways foundational, and because of its foundational nature being of a scale that would have made its creation a very kind of memorable event. Now, within the southern inner circle, we also know through Keeler's excavations and geophysical survey that we have within the circle a square setting of stones and a square setting which was created around the central obelisk. Keeler's work did produce a little bit of both early and middle Neolithic material from here. And again, it may hint that this belongs to an early kind of date. So we can imagine that Avebury perhaps begins at the end of the 4th millennium BC, contemporary with the beginnings of other key monuments like the first phase of Stonehenge, but also contemporary with what's going on in the Boyne Valley, what's going up on in terms of the increased scale of activity in mainland Orkney as well. We can then, or at least we have a hint that there may be something of a hiatus in terms of construction. And then around about 2500 BC, it's modified and it takes on a rather different character with the construction of the outer circle and the much more substantial earthwork. And it's worth pointing out with middle late Neolithic monuments that they are very, very unstable things. They often undergo quite marked points of metamorphosis. Okay, they radically or can radically change their form in various ways. So we can have situations where, for example, the stones of Stonehenge in Orkney, Avebury near Stonehenge, where we can see sequences which begin with the construction of large hall-like buildings, stone at Stonehenge, timber at Avebury, which then get enclosed by henge earthworks, which then get transformed from being structures that may be linked to the living to structures that are reserved sacred spaces, and perhaps ones more connected to the dead. We can see situations where we have things like henge monuments and freestanding stone circles that then get buried. For example, at Brynkethwy Ddu, where an initial henge and circle are then overlain by a passage grave. And of course, within the Avebury region, we know that at Silbury Hill, that originally began as a much smaller mound, which at one stage was set within a henge earthwork before it too was changed into a gigantic monumental mound. And of course, with things like Stonehenge as well, we've got this radical transformation from a simple earthwork with a relatively simple stone circle to a sarsen and bluestone structure, which is mimicking the form of wooden monuments like Woodhenge. So don't imagine that these things remain stable. They often underwent quite radically different processes of reworking, which transformed the nature of these spaces and quite often made these spaces more contained and more controlled as we go into the late Neolithic. So we can imagine that, you know, the Avebury of 3000 BC could be rather different in terms of its nature, rather different in its roles to the Avebury that belongs to the end of the Neolithic. Now, the other things we might consider, I'm conscious of time. I am more than halfway through, you'll be right here. So you know, why was it built where it was built? And, you know, why did it take the form that it did? Well, we've kind of hinted at issues of form in terms of the way in which perhaps it draws upon the form of other monuments, more distant monuments, or local structures like the Windmill Hill enclosure. In terms of why it was created where it was, well, it's quite likely that it's to do with both the kind of topographical affordances of this location. In fact, it's near the source of the Kennet. It seems to sort of lie in a position that suggests it may be the intersection of natural routeways through this landscape. And also, it's in an area where we've got evidence of prior settlement and activity. So it was, if you like, a place before it became a monument. It was a place that was inhabited. And in particular, we now have a suspicion that within the southern inner circle at least, that this was the focus for what was probably quite an important settlement event, occupation event, dating to the early part of the Neolithic, which was then remembered and then becomes, if you like, the focal point for the creation of the megalithic structures in this area. And the feature of particular interest are a range of post holes and gullies that are shown in green there, which Alexander Keeler excavated in 1939 and which he wrote off as being the remains of a medieval cart shed. I've not seen any other medieval cart sheds around, so we don't really have much to compare it with. It's worth pointing out that he stopped his excavations at this point because it was September 1939 and something was going on, and you know, the problems basically, and wrapped things up rather quickly. Curiously, he recognised the post holes within the structure as being prehistoric, but not the later gullies. Now, one thing we can say is that those features are associated with early Neolithic material culture, and we know that while there was a lot of medieval activity in this area, all the medieval finds are basically sort of locked in the plough soil over the top of these features. So were it a medieval building, you'd expect medieval material, pottery and so forth to be present within those feature fills. But critically, we can now compare the plan of this structure to that of a good number of early Neolithic houses which have been excavated in Britain and Ireland, and it bears a stunning kind of resemblance. So the combination of form, the combination of association with early Neolithic material culture leads us to believe that this is the remains of an early Neolithic house, likely going off the dates of others, dating to about 3,700, thereabouts. What's also telling is the way in which the subsequent megalithic settings, in particular the square setting within the southern inner circle, basically follows the same axis as that structure, and seems almost to take the dimensions of that structure and kind of multiply them by 4. So they seem to be laying out those megaliths in relation to the traces of that building, traces of that house. They're commemorating it and monumentalizing it, even if perhaps a few centuries after the structure has gone out of use and rotted and remains as both memory and archaeological trace. So there's a sense here that at least this part of the monument may begin as a series of settings which are commemorating a particularly important building, and presumably commemorating the people, the kind of lineage who occupied that building. Of course, what we need to do is now know what's going on with the northern inner circle, where we have that box-like setting of stones that make up the cove, which in terms of their format and plan are curiously similar to the early Neolithic structure within the southern inner circle. So it's possible that Avebury begins by commemorating a series of foundational buildings relating to foundational occupation events that could be connected to important lineages in the landscape, and that during the Middle Neolithic, those lineages are seeking to kind of assert power and preeminence and position by commemorating and marking the place of their ancestors. Something else that's also interesting, which I've hinted at, is the fact that we can see that perhaps just before the henge is constructed, and certainly more marked after it's constructed, it acts as a kind of notional point of contrast and division within the landscape. We have a situation where, as we go into the Middle and Late Neolithic, the zone to the west becomes devoid of settlements, and we've looked very intensively, even through things like watching briefs and so forth, all across this area, and have not found any trace of Middle or Late Neolithic settlements. The closest is off at Windmill Hill, which is further to the northeast. Whereas this zone over to the east, going down the side of Waden Hill, going up onto Hackpen and Overton Hill, remains quite busy, especially during the Middle Neolithic and the Late Neolithic activity up along Overton Hill. So there's a sense of sort of contrasting zones in the landscape, in places where people are living and places where people are not living, which are kind of focused on the henge itself. It's not to say that people weren't active within this part of the landscape. They may be grazing animals, might be doing all sorts of other things, but this was not a space for the living. So pulling these things together, first of all, contrary to English heritage, this is not how Avebury was built. It was more complex. It was built as a sequence of events. Also, we've got to get away from ideas that Neolithic architecture is about creating spaces within which activities could happen. Instead, we've got to think about building earthworks, building stone structures as things which are responding to the kind of qualities and connotations of place. They're about containing places, marking them off as sacred, special, restricted, and so forth. And we've also got to think about that element of metamorphosis. We've got to think about monuments as kind of, changing living entities as well. And monuments as having these sort of condensations of connections, histories, and links to people and events and so forth. Now, in terms of that first phase of Avebury, that middle Neolithic phase, it could be that we could link it into other key monuments and locations within this landscape. The connection with Windmill Hill, something I've mentioned. It may be that the West Kenneth Avenue occupation sites, with its kind of rich range of material and with evidence of lots of non-local material, could represent a location where people were coming together and living while the first phase features of Avebury were being constructed. It stands out as something exceptional in terms of being a gathering point, in terms of the nature of presence there. We've also got other sort of odd things happening in the Middle Neolithic. We have places like Millbarrow, Chamber Tomb, off to the north of Windmill Hill, which is very, very late in date, constructed at the same time as the occupation site, which is slightly archaic or anachronistic in its form, and it's tempting there to perhaps sort of think of that as being connected, as being a kind of burial place linked to some of those communities who are responsible for making the first phase of the Avebury monument. So, in a way, the issue here is to think about these monuments in terms of how they might develop in relation to histories and events within these landscapes, which can involve settlement events, but events which are remembered and recalled, and which take on a special significance, as you see, for example, with the house inside the Southern Inner Circle at Avebury, and recognise as well the way in which the kind of values and qualities of places kind of change and unfold over time, and recognise things as well, such as lineage presence and lineage politics and power, and how people might use those histories of presence within landscapes as a pretext for making monuments which kind of commemorate or try to consolidate that power in various ways. And Alistair Whittle, started off with talking about Mick Aston. Alistair Whittle also is someone who should be sort of mentioned as being quite sort of important and fundamental in terms of research within this region. Much of what we do sort of follows on from the work that he undertook in the area in the 1980s, 1990s. But more recently, he's been calling for us to try and think about prehistory more in historic terms, and that's all linked into his drive to ensure that we create better kind of chronologies so that we understand much more about how things happened and when things happened. And in the process, this is making the Neolithic much more interesting. It's showing how much change there is, how much variation, how we're moving away from a rather sort of static, timeless sense of prehistory to a sense of prehistory where there are important kind of narratives and changes and events. And this is the kind of framework that we really need to put Avebury into. So, of course, the obvious thing is to think about the fact that, there's need for more work at the monument. It has to be a kind of research priority, particularly to kind of investigate features to understand sequence and chronology and activity of various kinds. We've done a lot of work in the surrounding landscape. It's presumably now time to look at the monument itself. I just throw it out there, there could even be interesting collaborations perhaps between universities and organisations like Cotswold Archaeology in terms of actually starting new campaigns of work at key sites like this. And I shall end there with acknowledgement to colleagues, particularly people like Mark Gillings, Ben Chan and Charlie French, Mike Allen, Bos Cleal and so forth, who've been very much sort of partners in all this work.
Well, thank you so much, Josh. What a fascinating story, history before history, and just an insight into how dynamic archaeology can make prehistory, which can be hard to comprehend sometimes. The time spans are so great, but somehow it is possible through archaeology to begin to get insights into how people lived and perhaps fought in that deep past. We are going to have some questions. For people online, please remember to do this via the Q&A box only, not via the chat function. We're also going to take questions from the room, and I'll have to repeat them into the microphone just so that people online can hear them. So sorry if that seems a bit boring. What we're going to do is, this is really encouraging. We've got so much technology today, but we're going to revert back to Kaz giving me post-it notes of the questions that people have asked, which sounds like a technology I feel much more comfortable with. But why don't we start off in the room? Has anyone got a question for Josh from here in the room in Cirencester? Gentleman at the back.
Do we still consider the avenue to be a processional avenue? Because where it goes across the road, it seems to sort of completely split off in a different way, as though it's not meant to sort of flow. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I just said the question is for people online is, do we believe that the avenue is a sort of processional way?
Well, of course, there are two avenues. There's West Kent Avenue and the Beckhampton Avenue. Oh, sorry, get that bit back into focus. Actually, when you look at the detail of how those avenues connect to the Henge, the one thing that's quite striking, as you point out, is the fact that they don't do it very well. And with the Beckhampton Avenue, we get a sense that it's more or less kind of running alongside the routeway into the monument. It's more or less hitting the bank, and it may be there's similar things happening with the West Kent Avenue. So one possibility is that people, if they were to process, were processing alongside the avenues rather than down the avenues. And it may be that the avenues themselves, if we take an argument that's been put forward that stone is linked more solidly to ancestral realms, spiritual realms, perhaps the avenues are spirit pathways, whereas the corporeal pathways, as it were, are running alongside.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to a sorry, going to come in. Go to a post-it note. And first question, which is really interesting, when did you do the dig at Avebury? And much more importantly, are you doing any more digging at Avebury?
Okay, so in terms of the work in the surrounding landscape, a lot of that's happened between 2013 up until the present. The one bit of excavation we have been able to do in Avebury itself was when the cove stones were being stabilised, and that was back in 2002, I think it was. We are still doing little bits of work in Avebury and its environs, and as I mentioned, we're now seriously sort of thinking about pulling together the kind of justification, as it were, to do work actually within the monument itself. So things are still going on.
Okay. We've had one comment that someone said they did think they were actually going to be tested on the "you will be tested on this" slide, and have asked for that slide to be put back up. So what we'll do is this talk will be on our YouTube channel later, so you can pause your YouTube video at the appropriate moment. But I'm going to ask a really great question now. And what would Josh suggest would constitute a good day out in Avebury? Do you try and see everything on one visit? And if so, where would you begin?
Oh, that's a very good question. There's quite a lot to see. So if you've only got a day, the thing to do obviously is start off by visiting the Henge. You can then walk down part of the West Kenneth Avenue. You can walk over the top of Waden Hill, which is kind of natural hill running down from the south of the monument. And that gives you a good view of Silby Hill. If you've still got energy, you can then go down past Silby Hill, cross the A4 carefully, very carefully, and go up and see the West Kenneth Long Barrow. But I think it's a kind of landscape where it's good to go back, and it's good to spend time exploring the monument itself. It's good to wander up onto Windmill Hill, where you get a really nice kind of sense of the landscape. It's good to go up onto Overton Hill as well, see some of the Bronze Age barrows up there. So the area is very rich in archaeology, and it always repays return and further investigation. And even with the monument itself, I mean, everyone gets sort of locked into walking around the western side, where a lot of the restoration work by Keeler was done. It's good to look at the eastern part of the monument, which hasn't been impacted by 20th century excavation. And actually, one thing that's really interesting is just walking the bottom of the ditch. Get a very different impression of the world if you're exploring the site in the base of the ditch.
It's a good answer. I've got so many questions. We're not going to get through all of these, but and they're all such great questions. Are there any traces or theories regarding possible other avenues in other directions beyond the ones known?
Okay, so we've got the West Kenneth Avenue, we've got the Beckhampton Avenue, both are stone avenues. Both were recorded by early antiquaries, William Stukeley especially. So far, there's not any trace of avenues to the north or to the east, even though there are entrances to the monument to the north and the east. I think if there had been megalithic avenues, we would have found traces of them. But that's not to say that there couldn't be timber avenues, for example. So it's something that sort of requires further investigation. Again, it may be that the contrast between, directions, orientations, which are more connected to ancestral realms marked by stone avenues, versus directions, routes in, routes out, which are more connected to realms of the living. So that's another possibility for why we don't have 4 megalithic avenues.
Thank you. Keep going. Josh is going to earn his corn tonight. You said the area may always have been open. If so, wouldn't it have just been colonised by scrubland and trees? How was it kept open?
Right. Okay. Well, open is probably a bit of a simplification. I mean, there would have been trees, there would have been woodland, but the suggestion is that it would have been more like parkland woodland during the Mesolithic into the early Neolithic. So areas where you've got grassland, where you've got trees, but you've got quite open kind of understory, as it were. What we do see, though, again, with some of the charcoal records for the Middle Neolithic, is perhaps there being a bit more scrub around at that time. And then as we go into the late Neolithic, then we see in the core of the region, we see very open conditions, conditions of grazed grassland. So it does vary a bit. There's certainly sort of tree cover in there, but it's just not the model that we used to have, where we imagine that during the Mesolithic, we had this thick blanket of woodland covering this area. The other thing to take account of is the fact that there would have been a lot of natural spreads of sarsen stone within the bottoms of the valleys, and that would have inhibited vegetation growth.
Is there any other questions in the room? I have so many post-it notes, so I don't feel you have to, but if anyone's got a burning question in the room, do say. In which case,
I don't.
oh, yeah, sorry, gentlemen.
You mentioned a third class arrowhead.
Yes.
And I read somewhere a suggestion that maybe this was practice sites,
Yes.
almost schooling.
Yes.
But can you have any idea that that would be possible?
So the question is, can you really know whether someone was just practicing the flint knapping?
I mean, certainly, I mean, going off the quality, you know, we've got a couple of examples where it does look like someone is really trying. So they're, you know, could be really quite young individuals. We did have, within that sort of beaker scatter, we did have one really interesting bit of flint, which was a reused flake. It's probably, you know, a Neolithic flake that had been picked up in the early Bronze Age. And in one part of it, it's got these really nice bits of almost like pressure flaking on it. And then a bit further around the edge, we've got this slightly, you know, badly handled attempt at pressure flaking. And I almost wonder whether that's a piece which someone has sort of picked up and said, look, this is how you do it. Have a go. And someone else has tried. So that's the closest I think I've seen to what may be, you know, an exercise in kind of teaching or practice. Yeah.
Okay, I've just been handed yet another part. If we go through all these, we're never going home tonight. But I'm going to take a couple more. One, there were some certain questions about. You said that the human skull had been modified. Can you, people have asked, what do you mean by modified? Can you explain?
Okay. I don't know why, but we found a few bits of Neolithic human skull which have turned up on the sites that we've looked at, where you've basically got traces of the skull being sort of slightly broken or trimmed to create, you know, dare say almost like a kind of a bowl-shaped element of cranium. So probably quite sort of simple flaking, if you like, to actually sort of reduce it down. Don't ask me what they're doing with them.
We're going to go for two. We're going to go for two more. And then I think Josh's voice is probably about to give out, I think. This is a great question. Is there any pattern to the size and shape of the stones in the henge or in the barrows? Or did they collect certain sorts of stone, or are they just kind of random?
Yes. The answer is yes. So if you look at the henge, for example, there were differences in terms of the size of the stones making up the inner circles versus the outer circle. So the inner circle stones tend to be larger. If you look at the outer circle, they went for larger and more naturally geometric stones for those that were flanking the entrances. And also there seems to be evidence of kind of grading in stone size around the outer circle. So the largest stones appear to be in the southwest part of the circle. And that actually fits a pattern that we see elsewhere in the UK with stone circles, where often that southwest side is emphasized. So they are being quite careful about the stones that they choose to make up different parts of the circles and possibly the avenues as well.
So last question. What role, if any, did Keeler's reconstructions play in the landscape archaeology? Have the concrete pillars helped or hindered observation understanding of the site?
Yeah, well, that's a good one. That's a good one. It certainly changed the nature of Avebury. So there weren't that many stones that were sort of standing before his work took place. Obviously, his process of restoration, the re-erection of the stones, the marking of the stones that they're missing, made it more of a tourist site. So that also had a positive impact in terms of the fact that it then constrained development of the village, and there were actually quite big proposals at various points to create larger areas of housing within the henge. So it's been a positive in terms of preserving the site, in terms of presenting the site. But it all has also kind of almost kind of fossilized a kind of image of what the monument was perhaps like for part of its history. And also it has had a strange effect on the way that visitors behave, in that visitors will inevitably focus on the bits which have been restored and often not venture out into parts of the monument which haven't been subject to Keeler's excavation and restoration. It's kind of created a monument of two halves. like quite a sort of pristine, manicured western half, and then quite a wild eastern half to the monument.
Great. Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you for all the questions from the room and also online. And sorry if we haven't had a chance to answer everybody's question this evening. Hasn't that been great? I mean, it's a real skill to make a complex thing intelligible and understandable. And I think the way Josh has handled those questions shows that he has an absolutely amazing understanding and knowledge of that landscape and indeed of the broader history of the area. I've learned so much personally tonight. I mean, it's a complex story, isn't it? I mean, I sometimes think of the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, but the complexity, almost the pulsing of how those periods changed and ebbed and flowed, a very dynamic story, complicated, but perhaps one that, as you drill deeper into it, can begin to give you insights into how people acted and how they believed. And perhaps in prehistory, you see archaeology at its purest form. Josh has done a great service to us tonight by coming to Cirencester and talking about his amazing work. He's done it with skill, verve, and his characteristic enthusiasm. It's a brilliant way to deliver our 30th annual lecture. And I'd like you all to join me online and in the room in thanking Josh so much for what he's given us tonight.
Just for fans of Father Ted, that hill small, that hill far away.
Very good, very good. So a few last things. Got to thank some people. Obviously thank Josh in particular. Thank you in Cirencester for coming tonight. To thank everyone online. How many people we have online tonight?
At least 500.
500 people online. Isn't that incredible? So, and I imagine from all over the world knowing, so, the power of that site to attract an audience. It never ceases to amaze how British archaeology just resonates around the globe. It's such a great thing that we can do this hybrid form now where we're in the room and we're online. And we want to say big thank you to Kaz Adams and Indy Jago, because without them, we couldn't make that possible. So let's give them a big thank you. And also to thank our hosts at the Crinean Museum, Emma Stewart, Caroline Morris, and the team for the facilities. So lastly, it just remains for me to say thank you for your attention. Please do not forget to complete the online survey, or if you're in the room, the survey outside the door. And lastly, I hope very much to see you next year for our 31st annual lecture, which I hope has become a bit of a fixture in the calendar. So thank you to Josh, thank you everybody, and good night.